What is strategic foresight? How can we effectively integrate strategic foresight into strategic planning and management? And what are some of the key ways to engage in sustainable foresight practices that facilitate strategic thinking, acting, and learning? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Professor Bert George of the City University of Hong Kong and author of the IBM Center Report, Embedding Strategic Planning and Management, International Recommendations. So what prompted you, Bert, to write this report?
Well, I think I was confronted with looking at strategic planning in many governments. I was confronted with the fact that too often strategic planning is becoming a very linear, almost automatic exercise. So it's more like operational planning, right? So we have a plan which we try to make measurable, and then we kind of just focus on reporting that every year, and that's about it. And people were forgetting that strategic planning ought to be about the future, about handling this kind of volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world and developing capabilities to be able to tackle that. So I saw that strategic planning was often lacking strategic foresight. And I thought, well, people are doing foresight, clearly. So there's an opportunity to try to connect both. So that was really one of the main reasons to try to get people to think more about the future during strategic planning.
Bert, you mentioned earlier that, the shiny new object is strategic foresight, but could you explain to us maybe briefly what exactly we are talking about when we use the term strategic foresight?
So I think in a way, strategic foresight originally is actually coming from the strategic management field. And the core idea was to basically enable strategists to think more about the future, but also prepare better for multiple possible futures when they did strategy, right? So the idea was, let's not have one fixed mindset of the future. Let's try to think about the future as something fluid with many potential kind of scenarios and prepare for that. So that's how it originated, I think, a bit more in the corporate world. But now when you look at strategic foresight in government, I think it has become something a bit different, in the sense that it tends to be a lot more scientific, a lot more kind of at the macro level, so the level of countries and how they're faced with all these challenges in their environments. And it's also really very much linked to policy making more general. So I think the core idea is you're trying to gaze at the future and basically using strategic foresight techniques, try to understand the future better and try to develop the policies that can enable you to tackle that future, or even tackle multiple potential futures. And that's maybe the biggest difference from strategic planning, where typically people think about the future more in the sense of we have a vision. This is what we want the future to look like, and we're going to plan for that. Strategic foresight does not necessarily assume that, you can say this is what we want the future to look like. It's more about, it's very likely the future will be different from what you expect. So let's try to prepare for that, and let's try to develop the capabilities to meet that. So I think that's kind of how you differentiate both.
One of the things I liked about your report, Bert, was that you used a case study methodology, and you had four very different cases, one from Singapore, one from Flanders, the European Union, and here in the US, the Government Accountability Office. They were spanning different constraints and different continents, actually, different governments. I was wondering, Bert, what commonalities surprised you most when you look at these diverse contexts?
Okay, so I think perhaps what surprised me the most was the fact that in terms of the people doing strategic foresight, they were actually relatively similar across these different contexts. So I wasn't necessarily expecting that. I was expecting to see some contextual differences in terms of who is actually doing strategic foresight. So you saw across all these cases that typically strategic foresight teams combined, let's say, more almost ad hoc kind of scientific insights, so really content specialists who are basically able to make scientific predictions about the future, who understands big trends like AI, geopolitics, global warming, all these different kind of themes. And then at the same time, you tended to have a smaller kind of core team of people who were good at strategy, but also very good at what we would call co-production. So basically bringing different people together to do strategy together. And those type of people I saw in every case. Even though they maybe did foresights a little bit different across the cases, the people actually doing it were quite similar. So that really stood out for me.
You do a wonderful job with the case studies, but from the case studies, you create a framework in which you bucket your recommendations, and there are significant recommendations in terms of quantity. I'd like to talk about the framework, and that is governance, capabilities, processes, and practice. Can you walk us through, Bert, this framework, and using the metaphor as you like, the building of a house?
Yes, yeah. So I think one of the core ideas behind the report was I wanted to go beyond simply recommending a tool, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, tools are very valuable, right? But there are so many toolboxes out there about foresight from the OECD, the United Nations. So that's there. What I kind of really care about, being a strategist myself, is this sustainable integration of strategic foresight into this organizational routine of strategic planning and management. So the idea was that, if we look at it from that perspective, we're trying not to just develop a tool or recommend a tool, we're trying to develop a system. And to build a system, right, you need to have a very strong foundation, which is really where the capabilities matter, right? Having the capabilities in place to actually be able to do strategic foresight during strategic planning and management. You need to also have the structures in place, which is more a governance question. So that's kind of the rooftop that overarches this entire house, if I can call it that way. You need to have these structures, including political commitments, clear mandates. That's all part of that. And then if you want to look at the walls, you want to have more the processes and the practices to kind of, keep the house standing up in a way. I think the processes are more about having actual steps to integrate foresight. And then the practice is also about, people's perception of how useful it is. Is it actually doing something that matters? So I think if you take capabilities, the foundations, governance, the roof, process and practice, the walls together, you really have something that is a sustainable way forward to integrate strategic foresight into planning and management. And that was really important for me. I didn't want people to just only build a wall, only build a rooftop, only build the foundation. It really had to be kind of a house that would make this a lot more durable. That was really the idea here.
Yeah, you note in the report, Bert, that strategic foresight, may be easier to link and to certain other tools like agile design approaches. But for a government that's still using more traditional planning methods, I was wondering if you had any advice for getting started if you're that fledgling organization in the government that wants to do that integration.
Yeah, I think it's always a question of resources and time. So to answer your question, I think if I would, and I do a lot of executive teaching, and sometimes I have people working in small governments, local governments, regional governments that don't necessarily have the capability to really do like full foresight. Because the cases that I analyze, it's like very top level public organizations who, they have a lot of capabilities in place to do this type of work. So if I would be advising, governments that are relying also on these traditional approaches and maybe don't have capabilities for a full-fledged exercise, I think, just starting from a very simple step in your planning in which you're asking the what if question, right? So in our strategic planning models, we always have a step which we call kind of reassessing or evaluating your developed plan, right? Just during that step, just kind of injecting the question, what if? So looking at your political, economic, social-cultural, technological, ecological, and legislative environment, so PESTEL we call that, and just asking a question with every letter of PESTEL, what if? What are worst case scenarios? What are best case scenarios? And are we kind of prepared for that? I think just taking that one step can already be a very crucial robustness check for your strategic plan. So I would certainly recommend that as a good place to start. And, as you get better at it, of course, you will build additional capabilities that'll be very useful. But just doing that step, I think, is a great start.
Bert, if a government agency listening to the show wanted to start strengthening the connection between their foresight and planning functions tomorrow, what would be your top 3 recommendations?
So the first recommendation, I think, would be to basically mix the teams. So I would say mix it up and have your foresight people and your strategic planning people basically talk to each other, right? You could start off very slow, have like a strategic offsite, talk about how you can strengthen each other. So that can be a first step, just meeting each other, talking with each other, understanding why you need each other and how you can collaborate. And then you can kind of build on that, right? Then you can really exchange team members. You can focus on maybe following each other for some period of time to understand what you're doing. So I think that's one very, very main recommendation, to just have these 2 groups of people connect and talk with each other. So this is more people integration. I think the second recommendation would be more process integration. So, like we said before, during your strategic planning exercise, and also your reviews, make sure there is at least one step that, has these foresight ideas in it. Start off small. You don't have to do these massive, extensive foresight exercises. Just start with the basics and, ask yourself the question, what if, looking at these pestle evolutions, I think that can be an important second thing. And then the third recommendation there would really be more recommendation linked to training. So be very careful to offer separate trainings. I think too often strategic planning and management, foresight, they become part of different packages for different people. I think they should be integrated into one training package, right? You're training someone to be a strategist, which means they have to do planning, but they also have to have some foresight capabilities and vice versa. So I think those 3 would really be my recommendations: people integration, process integration, and then probably training integration.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with authors, with Professor Bert George of the City University of Hong Kong and author of the IBM Center Report, Embedding Strategic Foresight into Strategic Planning and Management, International Recommendations. You can download this report and all Center reports at businessofgovernment.org. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Apple Podcast, Spotify, Audible, or on your favorite podcast app. And as always, at businessofgovernment.org.